The wind hit the door like a fist, and Ethan Calloway almost didn't open it. It was the kind of November night that swallowed sound whole, the kind where a man could lose his way between the house and the barn if he wasn't careful. So when the knock came, 3 weak raps, barely audible over the storm, he nearly mistook it for a branch against the shutters. He opened the door anyway. A woman stood on his porch, snow-crusted white in her dark hair, her coat too thin for a Montana winter. She was swaying on her feet, one hand braced against the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I saw the light. I don't need much. Just somewhere warm. For tonight." Ethan Calloway was 38 years old, a widower for the past year and 4 months, and he had learned the hard way that kindness had a cost. But he stood back from the door anyway and let her in, because the alternative was watching a stranger freeze on his porch, and he wasn't built for that kind of cruelty. That was how it started. Not with love, not with anything so grand, just an open door on a cold night, and a woman who called herself Rosalind Hartley. She was 32, she told him later, sitting by his fire, with a blanket around her shoulders, and her boots drying by the hearth. She'd come west, following a husband who died of fever 3 towns back, and a job that had fallen through before she ever reached it. She had $11 to her name and nowhere to be. Ethan didn't ask more than that. It wasn't his business, and besides, he had 2 children upstairs who needed him more than he needed answers from a stranger. It was Mary who found her first. 6 years old, barefoot despite the cold floors, peering around the doorframe with the particular boldness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of new faces. "Are you an angel?" Mary asked. "Papa says angels don't visit anymore, but you look like one. You're all white." "That's just snow, sweetheart," Rosalind said, and something in her voice softened in a way Ethan noticed even through his exhaustion. "But thank you. That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in a long while." Daniel, 9 years old and more guarded than his sister, said nothing at all. He watched from the stairs with his mother's eyes. Ethan saw it every time, the way Daniel's gaze had inherited Sarah's caution, her habit of sizing up a room before trusting it. Sarah had been gone since the previous July, a fever that came on fast and took her faster, the way these things sometimes did out here, far from any real doctor. Ethan didn't talk about it. He'd learned that grief, unspoken, was easier to carry than grief that had to be explained to sympathetic faces. By morning, the storm hadn't broken. If anything, it had worsened, the wind carrying snow sideways past the windows in sheets so thick the barn was barely visible from the house. "You should stay," Ethan said, more practical than kind. "Nobody's traveling in this." Rosalind nodded, but there was something working behind her eyes. Calculation, maybe, or desperation dressed up as an idea. She found him by the stove that afternoon, while the children napped, and she said the words that would change the shape of his winter. "Let me stay," she said. "Not just today. I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll raise your children like they're my own. I don't need wages, not much. Just a roof, and enough food to keep working. I saw the way that boy looks at you, like he's trying to be strong for you. And that little girl needs someone to braid her hair, who isn't grieving too hard to remember how." Ethan Calloway had spent a year learning to say no to things that felt too good to be true. But he looked at this woman, hollow-cheeked, proud despite her circumstances, offering herself up as help instead of charity, and something in him recognized a kind of desperation he understood. "I can't pay you proper wages," he said. "Ranch barely breaks even most years." "I'm not asking for proper wages," Rosalind said. "I'm asking for a place to be useful." He should have said no. Every practical bone in his body told him a stranger in his house was a risk he couldn't afford, not with 2 children and a mortgage on land that the bank could take back if he missed one more payment. But Mary had already claimed a spot beside Rosalind at the breakfast table that morning, and Daniel had, for the first time in months, laughed at something. A small thing, barely a sound, but Ethan had heard it from the next room and felt his chest ache with how much he'd missed it. "All right," he said. "Through the winter. We'll see how it goes." The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Ethan hadn't realized his household was missing. Rosalind rose before dawn to get the fire going. She taught Mary to braid her own hair, patient through every tangled attempt, and she found ways to draw Daniel out of his careful silence, not by pushing, but by simply being present, asking him to help her with tasks that made him feel needed rather than managed. "You handle a horse well for a city boy," Rosalind told him one afternoon, watching Daniel lead the mare back to the barn. "I'm not a city boy," Daniel said, but there was the faintest pride in his voice. "No," Rosalind agreed. "I don't suppose you are." Ethan watched these small exchanges from a distance, the way a man watches something he's afraid to hope for too much. He hadn't laughed easily since Sarah died. He hadn't expected to laugh again at all. But there were evenings now, after the children were asleep, when he and Rosalind sat by the fire and talked. About nothing important, about the weather, about the town gossip she'd picked up from the one trip they'd made into Millbrook for supplies. And he found himself looking forward to those quiet hours in a way that surprised him. He was careful not to name what he felt. It seemed disloyal to Sarah's memory, and besides, Rosalind had never once suggested she wanted more than the arrangement they'd made. She cooked, she cleaned, she raised his children with a gentleness that made his throat tight when he watched her tuck Mary in at night. That was the deal. He told himself that was enough. The trouble arrived in the form of Silas Whitfield, a land baron who'd been trying to buy out the smaller ranches along Miller's Creek for the better part of 2 years. Whitfield owned half the county already, and everyone knew his methods weren't always honest. Delayed water rights, bought off bank officials, pressure applied in ways that never quite broke the law, but bent it considerably. He rode out to the Calloway ranch in early December, his coat too fine for ranch work, his smile too practiced to be trusted. "Heard you've got a woman living out here now," Whitfield said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Not married to her, I understand. Folks in town are talking." "Folks in town can mind their business," Ethan said. "Might be easier for you if they didn't have reason to talk at all," Whitfield said. "I'm prepared to make you a fair offer for this land, Calloway. More than fair, given the state of your barn roof and that fence line that's been falling apart since summer. Take the money. Move somewhere easier. Nobody would blame a man raising 2 children alone for wanting an easier life." "This is my wife's land," Ethan said, and his voice had an edge to it that hadn't been there in months. "She's buried on it. I'm not leaving." Whitfield's smile didn't waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "We'll see how the winter treats you," he said, and rode off without another word. The banknote came due 3 weeks later, right as the temperature dropped and the sky took on the flat gray color that old-timers said meant a bad storm coming. Ethan had the money set aside, barely, but a letter arrived first, informing him the payment deadline had been moved up 2 weeks due to an administrative reassessment. Ethan didn't need to guess whose hand was behind that particular piece of paperwork. He rode into town, furious and frightened in equal measure, only to find the bank manager apologetic but unmovable. "Nothing I can do, Mr. Calloway." The terms came down from the regional office. Rosalind found him that evening sitting at the kitchen table, staring at numbers that didn't add up no matter how he arranged them. "We'll find a way," she said, sitting across from him. "There isn't a way," Ethan said. "Not in 2 weeks. Not with the cattle prices where they are." "Then we'll make one," Rosalind said, and something in her voice, steady, unafraid, made him look up at her properly, maybe for the first time since she'd arrived on his porch 3 months earlier. The blizzard came on the 13th of December, the worst one the county had seen in a decade. It started as ordinary snow in the early afternoon and became something else entirely by nightfall. Wind that screamed against the house, snow that piled against the doors faster than a man could clear it, cold that seeped through walls that had never felt so thin. Halfway through the evening, Daniel burst into the kitchen, breathless and pale. "Papa, the cattle, the north fence. I heard it go. I think the herd's getting out toward the ravine." Ethan was already reaching for his coat when Rosalind caught his arm. "You can't go alone," she said. "Not in this. You won't find your way back. I don't have a choice. If that herd goes over the ravine edge in this dark, that's everything, Rosalind. That's the whole ranch. Then I'm coming with you." He wanted to argue. Every instinct told him to leave her safe by the fire with the children. But he'd seen the way she worked a rope during the autumn roundup, steadier than he'd expected from a woman who claimed no ranch experience, and he was out of time to argue. "Mary, Daniel, bar the door behind us, and don't open it for anyone but our voices," Rosalind said, already pulling on a coat 2 sizes too large. Sarah's old coat, Ethan realized with a pang, though there was no time to feel strange about that now. The blizzard outside was worse than anything Ethan had ridden through in 15 years of ranching. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The cold bit through every layer he wore, but Rosalind stayed beside him, matching his pace, calling out through the wind when she spotted a break in the fence line he'd nearly ridden past in the dark. They found the herd bunched at the ravine's edge, spooked and confused. 3 cows, already dangerously close to the drop, where the snow had drifted over the true edge of the land. Ethan worked the rope, and Rosalind, soaked through, hands raw with cold, worked alongside him without complaint, turning the herd back from the edge, one animal at a time, her voice steady, even when her body was shaking with cold. It took most of the night. By the time they got the herd back to the lower pasture and the mended fence held, Ethan's hands were numb, and Rosalind could barely stand. He half carried her the last stretch back to the house, and when Daniel threw the door open at the sound of their voices, Mary was crying with relief before either of them had even stepped inside. "You saved them," Ethan said later, once Rosalind was warm again, wrapped in blankets by the fire, color slowly returning to her face. "You didn't have to come out there. You could have stayed safe." "I told you," Rosalind said, her voice hoarse but certain. "I said I'd raise your children. That means raising them somewhere. This ranch is the only home they've got left of their mother. I wasn't about to let it go over a ravine in the dark." Ethan looked at her, really looked, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes after a night of nearly losing everything, that somewhere in the past 3 months, this stranger on his porch had become something he hadn't let himself name. Word of the night traveled fast, the way news always did in a small county, and it reached Silas Whitfield within the week, the rancher, and the woman he'd tried to shame out of town, riding into a blizzard together, to save a herd most men would have written off as lost. Whitfield rode out again in January, but this time there was no offer, no thinly veiled threat. He sat astride his horse at the edge of the property and simply watched for a long moment. Daniel repairing a fence rail under Ethan's instruction, Mary chasing the dog through fresh snow, Rosalind hanging laundry despite the cold, laughing at something one of the children had said. "I misjudged this place," Whitfield said finally, when Ethan came to see what he wanted. "Reckon I misjudged a lot of things." He didn't apologize outright. Men like Whitfield rarely did. But the banknote was quietly extended the following week. No explanation given. And the pressure that had been building against the Calloway ranch for 2 years simply faded, the way storms sometimes do when you least expect them to pass. Spring came slow that year, the way it always did in Montana. But it came. The fence line was mended proper by March. The herd had grown, not shrunk, and the banknote was paid in full by April, money saved through a winter that had tested every part of them and left them standing anyway. Ethan asked Rosalind to marry him on a Tuesday, without ceremony, while she was up to her elbows in bread dough and he was tracking mud across her clean floor. "I never meant to fall in love with you," he admitted. "I just meant to give a stranger a warm place for one night." "I never meant to stay," Rosalind said, flour still on her hands. "I just meant to survive one winter." "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." Ethan Calloway. It was probably a yes back in December, if you'd bothered to ask me while I was half frozen and hauling cattle back from a ravine. They married in May, under the cottonwood tree where Sarah was buried, because Rosalind had insisted Sarah's memory deserved to be part of the day, rather than hidden from it. Daniel walked Rosalind partway down the aisle himself, solemn and proud, and Mary scattered wildflowers with the single-minded joy only a 7-year-old could manage. Silas Whitfield sent a wedding gift that spring, a length of good fencing wire, practical and unglamorous, with a note that read simply, "For a ranch that earned the right to keep standing." Ethan never quite forgave the man for the winter he'd tried to cause, but he hung the note by the door anyway, a reminder that even hard men could be moved by witnessing something true. Years later, when people in Millbrook told the story, and they told it often, especially to newcomers passing through, they always ended it the same way, that the woman who begged to stay for one cold night ended up staying for a lifetime, and that the ranch she'd helped save stood strong through every winter that came after, because it had been built, in the end, not just on land, but on the kind of love that shows up in a blizzard and doesn't leave.